Hello. Hi. How's everybody feeling? I know I just woke everybody up. I was like, that's what happens when you have a microphone, right? You command attention and all that kind of stuff. You feel important. I'm important just like all of you are important in this room. First of all, we really thank you all for joining us for this segment and for this really important workshop and for this presentation. I know that we're competing with some things before we get started, right? We're competing with food, right? Now, food is a drug, right? That's why they have the Food and Drug Administration. So we're going to make sure we try to keep you all awake after you ate that delicious food in there, right? So we want to make sure we keep you awake with our presentation. My name is Andre Ward, by the way. I'm the Associate Vice President of Policy at the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. I've been there for about maybe 5 years now. I have a service provision background, been doing this work for about 15 years, but also going back a little bit further to Nat, so I would say at least over 25 years I've been doing this work. And I'll tell you why it's unique in that kind of way. And I'm going to pass it over to my colleague and the person that I call my partner in fighting policy crime, right? My colleague, Lily Shapiro.
Thank you. And some of you may have seen me react to the FDA joke because I've heard it a few times, but it is funny. Hi, everybody. My name is Lily Shapiro. I am Policy Counsel in the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. I have been there for about 1.5 years, although I have known of and admired Fortune for actually probably 20 years because I used to be a public defender in the Bronx in the house. Woo! We'll get to all the boroughs, I promise. So I've been working in and around the criminal legal system and juvenile justice system space off and on for about 25 years or so, obviously since I was 5 years old. There's my bad joke for the day. And it's wonderful to be here with all of you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
And just so you know, like Lily and I, Sean, we were up here taking photos. You saw us up here taking a photo? Oh, we would ask you all to join too, right? We're not selfish. Maybe we can do that at the end. We'll take a group photo, right? Like, hello, everybody, right? Or whatever. But as it happens, Lily and I share an office together. I don't know why we're taking a photo, right? Maybe we'll submit it to comms or something and they'll put it somewhere. But we share an office together. So we're around each other all the time. And I've known Lily, we've known each other for over a decade, right? A little bit, right? And so we've been around each other, working with each other, and I'm so really grateful to partner with her as we co-lead the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy. It's really important work for each of us. We're deeply committed and passionate to this work. I just came back from DC last night, as a matter of fact. Right? I was there for 3 days for another housing conference by the Corporation for State Government in partnership with DOJ and others to ensure that people with conviction histories are able to access housing without being discriminated against. So you being at this conference, right, to look at housing, supportive housing in a certain way certainly complements where I came from yesterday and what they're talking about. This is a national conversation that's happening. What was equally important during that conversation that was held yesterday and even 2 days during that 3-day process in that conference was the importance of language. Like, how are you engaging human beings that have been impacted by the criminal legal system? And notice I'm using human beings. I'm not saying ex-cons, I'm not saying convicts, I'm not saying inmates, I'm not saying felons, right? You all have heard those kind of terms, which essentially denote something negative. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And so I'm gonna get into this PowerPoint. We're gonna have some conversation. We're not gonna bore you. You're gonna be involved, right? Break into little groups, teach us something, because I think Lily and I can safely agree that we're students for the rest of our life. Our classroom is the entire universe. We're always learning something. And so you can also be our teachers too. So, Humanizing Language is the title of this PowerPoint. Engaging Humanizing Language, challenging stigma and stereotypes, challenges and opportunities. So how many people were here from a different state by showing hands? What state are you from? Pennsylvania, okay. Pennsylvania was there yesterday in DC. Anybody else, different states? Everybody here from New York City? Oh, man. Rochester, all good, right? New York, Rochester's in the house. Okay. Huh? Long Island may seem like the whole new world or something, right? It's like New York, part of New York too. Jersey? Okay, Jersey's in the house too. How many people here from Brooklyn by showing hands? Wow, Brooklyn. I'm from Brooklyn too, that's right. I'm from Brooklyn, right? Not hating any other boroughs, but Brooklyn is a thing. It's a situation when you're from Brooklyn, right? Oh, hold it closer, right? I thought I talked loud. I don't really need a mic because I can talk loud, believe me. How many people from the Bronx in this room? Bronx, BX, right? People from Queens? All right. How many people from Staten Island? Okay. Did I miss anything? Manhattan. Yeah. How many people from Manhattan in this room? Look, they didn't say just they didn't say Manhattan. They said Harlem, just specifically. I respect that. All good. I respect that. So we have a sense of where people are from, obviously from the 5 boroughs, some obviously from upstate New York. Thankful that Rochester came on down to join us, and Long Island, which is still New York City, and right, whatever, right? So, the Fortune Society, our mission, right? Our mission at the Fortune Society, we are a nonprofit organization that does advocacy and reentry work for people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system. We've been around for about 55 years doing this work. Our CEO, Joanne Page, who was on the panel, some of you may have attended it, has been leading the organization for over 30 years. And our organization is comprised of 50% of the people there are people impacted by the criminal legal system. At least 30% of our board are made up of people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system. And we have maybe close to 400 colleagues, maybe 500 now, right? Colleagues, right, that work at the Fortune Society. So we kind of live our mission, right? We believe in hiring our mission. We believe in empowering people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system in a way that they can live a life of contribution and model an example of transformation that other people can follow behind. I'm an example of that. I served 16 years of my life in prison, right? I've been home now 15 years. I think 15 years. I think I've done a few things in my life. I'm pretty grateful to be alive, to be able to be before folk like you, to go throughout the country and speak and be in different places. I took advantage of my opportunity while incarcerated to learn and to read, and education became a goal for me. And that was my odyssey of going in education. About a week after I was released from prison, in 2009, I started going to school, went on to earn a master's degree, a bachelor's, associate's, currently a doctoral student now, working on my doctorate degree, right? Kind of busy, met folk like Lily, who's like really inspiring, right? And I'm grateful for the applause, right? And I appreciate it, right? I'm simply a reflection of any of you in this room who commit themselves to whatever they want to be in the world can do that, right? Whatever the experiences are. And I'm saying all of it in context in terms of like Fortune hiring mission, not to arrogate to my self-importance, although we're all important in this room, right? But to demonstrate that human beings who have been impacted by the criminal legal system have tremendous capacity and agency to be whatever they want to be in the world if they have the opportunities to do that, one. But it starts with obviously identifying them as people, as human beings, as a starting point. So going back to our mission, right, to strengthen communities by promoting alternatives to incarceration and supporting successful reentry from incarceration, thus strengthening the fabric of our communities. We provide educational services, right? We provide employment services and access to government benefits and more. And we do this by believing, one, in people's capacity to change. Everyone in this room can change. We know that. 10 years ago, some of you in this room weren't thinking the way that you were thinking. Some of you may still look young, like 10 years ago, like, or some may not, right? Some may want to defy the aging process. How many people want to defy the aging process in this room, right? You want to look a little younger if you could, right? But we believe in people's capacity to change. And I think that's central, right, in really looking at how you empower human beings, centering the fact that they had the capacity to change their lives. And we believe that, right? That's one of our fundamental beliefs. We believe in building people's lives through service. Service that's informed by their needs, not us prescribing what people need, but we developing interventions for them based on their needs and their lived experiences. All too often, people who have been impacted by the criminal legal system have been historically excluded from the decision and discussion processes as it relates to what impacts their lives. Now, obviously, we're localizing ourselves in spaces and we're informing a discussion. We're telling people, nope, that's not how you do it, right? This is how it should be done based on our needs, based on our experiences. And at Fortune, we model that, right? We believe in building people's lives through that process. And our service provision, and we have a suite of services ranging from mental health services, substance use treatment services, employment, education, and what we're here today for to some degree is talking about housing, right? All of those things have been informed by people expressing what their needs are based on their experiences. The other thing is we believe in changing minds. And that's where Lily and I come in. Right? We go out there and we fight, right? And so that's why I said, earlier that Lily is my partner in fighting policy crimes. We go out in the world and we advocate. And I think we do a pretty decent job. I mean, right? Pretty decent job, although the kind of legislation that we really need to make the changes that had to be made hasn't happened as much as we want it to. So we're still continuing to fight, right? So we educate, we advocate, we promote creation of fair, humane, and a truly rehabilitative correctional system. And a little bit later on in the PowerPoint, we're going to talk about how some advocacy has resulted in systems change in an environment where it was highly unlikely. Lily, one of us will talk about it later on, one of us. So today's objectives, right? We'll learn the importance of humanizing language, why words are key. We'll talk about some key principles. We'll also talk about challenging stigmas and stereotypes. Like, what are the origins of stigma, right? Why stigmas are incorrect, and how do we overcome stigmas, which is very, very important. The other thing is, right, how do we overcome them? Examining the connection to the supportive housing space, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities? And it'll be an open forum. Like we said, we're going to have some discussion, and I'll turn it over to Lily. And I'll sit down. Or stand.
Thanks very much. So we just wanted to start by just exploring, and this is safe space. Actually, it would have been, if we were a smaller group, we could have done some community guidelines, community conversation rules, but let's put out there, this is a safe space, right? Because we're talking about stigma, we're talking about stereotype, we're talking about language that we all use, where that may come from. It happens, don't worry, you took one for the team because someone was gonna have that happen, right? See, safe space, right? So I want this to be a place where people can speak freely and certainly agree to disagree, but be respectful, right? And not to judge each other, right? Because we're all on a learning journey. This is something, this topic that we're digging into today is something Andre and I talk about all the time. I'm a lawyer. I went to law school. I studied history and literature, so I'm all about words and language, and I always have so much more to learn. And this has been a tremendous evolutionary process for me as well. So just wanted to put that out there. Did anyone have anything they want to add to that? So here I am talking about community rules, norms, and just it's me talking. But here we are. Okay, so question for everybody. Do you actually know whether or not each person you've interacted with today is someone who has been impacted by the criminal justice / criminal legal system? Do you know? That's a little bit of a gimme. You know. You do? Whether or not somebody has been?
No, not like that, but I know people
Oh, you know people who have been, yes. But you don't know if everybody you've interacted with necessarily has a conviction history, right? How many people in New York City, let's just take New York City, how many people in New York City do you think have conviction histories? Someone just take a guess, throw out a number. What? 10%? Someone said 50%? 80%? 70? Okay. What'd you say? 50, okay. It's 11% of the adult population, but that is, I know this is a sort of more nuanced crowd, right? People are thinking about this a different way. But 750,000 people in New York City, right? 750,000 people in New York City have conviction histories. This is something we talk about in our Fair Chance for Housing campaign all the time. And when we say that number, people are stunned. Because what does that mean? that means there is a good chance they have had a perfectly pleasant, safe, delightful interaction with somebody with a conviction very recently, if not that day. Maybe they bought coffee from them, right? Maybe it's someone who works in their child's school. Maybe it's their neighbor of many years, right? And this is important for this conversation and for grounding folks to realize part of why this is so important, this conversation we're having, is because we are interacting with people who can be affected by our words. I mean, all the time anyway, right? But this is another way in which we could be affecting people without realizing it by the things that we say. So just curious, have you found yourself thinking about, oh, actually, wait a minute. Before we get to that, you may have noticed that I said criminal justice / criminal legal system, right? Some people have moved away from saying criminal justice system. We chose this / intentionally just to highlight this issue, this words matter issue, because for some people, there is no justice in the system, or they have not experienced it as a justice system. For some people, they don't believe, they have not felt, they have not seen the goal of the system being to achieve justice. That can be both people who have been accused of crimes, people who have been harmed as well. There's a lot of myths out there about people who have been harmed by crime as well and what they want and what they believe. So we also chose today, Andre and I talked about this, the word impacted by, as opposed to involved with, right? A lot of times you'll say someone who has been involved with the criminal legal system. And we were thinking about how involved with implies a certain kind of agency, implies a willingness, right, to enter a relationship with the system, which is generally not there. That is not to take away from accountability, right? That's something we were talking about. It's not to take away from accountability if people made choices that led to being arrested, but it also, the point of impacted here is to highlight the systemic issues at play. Issues about race, issues about socioeconomics, issues about resourcing of neighborhoods, intergenerational issues as well. So that's why for today we were going with impacted by. Did you want to jump in on that at all? Okay. So do you,
Wait, we do
oh,
this, right? Lily and I are, you see, that's what we call ourselves, a dynamic duo, right? Because partners, we always do. Anything you want to say, you want to add to this? So if you see us do that, that's why we do that.
so do you find yourself thinking about the right terms to use, the right words to use when talking about people who've been directly impacted by the system? And you don't have to use the words I'm using right now, by the way, either. But do folks find, by a show of hands, do people find themselves thinking about that issue? Yeah. I know I do. And I find myself sometimes, allegedly for a shorthand reason, using a word like inmate or detainee, especially if I'm writing, right? Because you don't want to keep using a 5-word phrase over and over again, but then I have to stop and come back to some of the things we're going to get into today. So just wanted to put that out there as well. What terms do people typically use? And how has that changed over time? I know for me, back when I was a public defender, we tried to use people's names all the time when we were writing motions instead of saying the defendant, Mr. or Ms. So-and-so, right? Make the judge or whoever, the clerk who's reading the motion, remember there is a person there, right? Humanizing, exactly. So what about other folks? How has your use of language changed over time? If at all, sure.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. There's one thing that has always remained etched on my mind, and it is, why do we say formerly incarcerated? I mean, generally, we don't necessarily say formerly married or formerly anything else. And I just feel like we create all these titles for different groups in society that inevitably stigmatize these groups. And then we look for ways to correct that. Why do it in the first place?
Anyone have a thought on that? Besides yes? Good point. Anyone want to respond? All right, we might be a little early in the session for people to be speaking, but we're going to do more of that, right? So actually, this is a good point to turn to challenging stigmas and stereotypes. And I'm going to turn it back over to Andre, because I think that gets into that question, why in the first place, right? That's what we're trying to unpack, is the first place.
No, I think it's a really interesting point that she raises too, right? Because we don't say former presidents, right? We say President so-and-so, or such and such. And I think one of the reasons why we have moved toward using language like formerly incarcerated is because the terms that were used in the past to describe those who were in prison or jails was dehumanizing. So we had to have some starting point. Over time it evolves, right? We may get away from using formerly incarcerated people. We may use people that are being released from jail or prison. But then sometimes, right, the stigma that's associated with that is challenging, right? Because the very moment you say people released from jail or prison, you hear jail or prison, you don't even hear people. So we have a lot of work to do, and over time, the language evolves. And that's why we had these kind of conversations, so that we can inform each other. What is language that we could use, right, as we continue to evolve it over time? So thank you for raising that. So what are stereotypes and stigmas you hear on a day-to-day basis about directly impacted people? What do we see in the media, television, and more? And where do you think they come from? Anybody want to answer that question? And I'll say it one more time. What are some stereotypes or stigmas you hear on a day-to-day basis about directly impacted people? What do you see in the media, television, or more? Anybody? Don't all speak up at once, and I'll pick you. I'll call. Huh? That they're violent? Anybody else? They're criminals? Inmates? Mm-hmm. Even the imagery, right? When you see someone that's arrested, they do the perp walk. You see them walking with handcuffs. We don't know if they're guilty or not necessarily, but we automatically have been conditioned through the media narrative to believe that if someone's been arrested, that they're a convict, that they've done something wrong, but we don't necessarily know that for sure. Yes? Products of impoverished community, and there's truth to that, right? Many people who are in jails and prisons come from highly impoverished, low literacy communities. And we know that's historic, right? And Lily mentioned earlier about the systemic realities associated with that. Like people, there's no genetic basis to people like committing crime, right? We know that environment shapes people's decisions. Resources that are limited creates a certain psychology of survival. And then people start functioning in a way that they will survive by any means that they can. This is not like justifying it, but this is a fact, right? And we do the research, you'll be able to see the relationship. So any other thoughts, any other points? Anything else people care to share relative to this, right? And where do you think they come from, right? Where do you think these stereotypes come from? Yes? White America? Okay. And I know it's a general statement, it's white. It's not all white America, right? Because you have people that identify white in this room, not necessarily complicit in doing that. But I understand what you're saying, right? The dominant theme that's run by systemic racism, right, obviously shapes people's thinking to look at people of color, black and brown people in particular, a certain way. That's not all white folk in the room. Like Lily's my partner, she white folk, right? And so, but we know that the larger society and the dominant thinking among people who live in their ignorance and seek to sustain racism function in a way that demonizes people of color. Yes.
Thank you for sharing that. So we're going off script now. So how many of you lived in New York City in the late 1980s, 1990s? Right? And remember, I know, we were all very young. We were all just mere infants, in fact, at that point. What was the defining characteristic in the media in the late 1980s? What was the picture of dangerousness? What's that? The Bronx, okay. Yep, burnt out, but yep.
I'm sorry, guys from the Bronx, but me as a Caribbean American, I guess, when I first came here, the Bronx was like the picture of violent. Don't go there. The buildings are burnt out. There's crack everywhere, and it was us. That's what I saw. Yes.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Gangs,
And who were in those gangs?
minorities.
And I see, thank you.
Harlem was also known as one of those impoverished, like because Harlem was predominantly black, so Harlem was also considered one of those impoverished. So Harlem, but now it's a renaissance, but before Harlem was also known as, impoverished community.
Right, so these are the images we're seeing on the news growing up here. Oh, somebody got your hand up again.
But I'd also like to add that a lot of the gangs were formed because a lot of the kids were lacking families, and those gangs provided a lot of those same things that the families provided, though in a mild way. So.
Right. So now we're already digging beneath the the why, the issues there. But just to go back to the point about where did this all come from, right? Where does this come from? And we could go back even further. But the reason I'm bringing up the late 1980s is because of something that whatever one thinks about who should have won the city council election in Harlem, it's pretty amazing to see Yusuf Salaam, one of the Central Park Five, the exonerated five, being out and about and able to run that campaign, right? And I think about growing up here and being, I don't want to say how old I was, but being a young woman, a young white woman in the late 1980s, and the media was telling me to be terrified of young black men, period. That's what it was, right? In the images from the Bronx, in the images from Harlem, and in the publicity and the rush to judgment, and the former occupant of the White House's full-page ad about those five young men, right? That's what the message was. That's still what the message is, right? It might come out differently sometimes. I see your hand, but we'll come back to you in a minute, right? And I just wanted to share another thing, which is, several years ago, now I'm forgetting how many years ago, 7 years ago, New York State finally raised the age of criminal responsibility, some of you may know, right? So before that, all 16, 17-year-olds, regardless of what they were charged with, were automatically in adult courts, right, among many other things, right? Now, that has since been changed, but in the opposition to raising the age, an upstate white district attorney was railing about the dangerous people who were going to wind up in family court with a slap on the wrist. And what was he showing? He was showing images pulled from Facebook of some young black teenage boys doing incredibly stupid things on social media, right? He didn't have to say the words. Those were the pictures he showed, right? So I just wanted to uplift. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name earlier. Toy. I wanted to uplift what Toy said and just dig into that for a minute, right? That especially live in New York City and with history being made in the recent election, it's sort of hard not to just go there. So just wanted to share those thoughts.
Yeah, and it's important too, right? Again, the predators, the super predators, right? Remember one president whose name I will not mention, but you know who I'm talking about. Took out that full page ad, right? And talking folk are super predators and that people should be executed, right? At least that's my memory serves correct. But those kind of narratives that are put in the media obviously shape the psychology of us in the public. And we oftentimes, in our failure to really dig into and examine where those things come from, we run with it. And then ultimately have that a part of our conversations and our perceptions, even how we look at people, right? So, challenging stigma and stereotypes continue, right? this us versus them mentality, right? It's always about like the enemy, the opposition, those people over there. And we think about people with conviction histories or people that are formerly incarcerated, formerly detained, et cetera, it's always like those folk over there, right? And I know even the service providers, we sometimes say, you know, we work with this population, right? Some of my advocacy partners have a real concern even about that, right? Why this can't be human beings? Work with people, right? We work with this population, which is distinct and like puts people in this category over here, which also causes some challenges, right? Cross-cultural variabilities, right? We think about race, we think about morals, we think about religions. All those things like feed like how we perceive the world, how we interact with people, what we feel is most acceptable to us. And sometimes our reasoning could be faulty, even though it comes out of these bases, right, of race and morals and religion, right? It even feeds sometimes the stigma and sustains the stigma and stereotypes and doesn't result in any real development in terms of recognizing human beings for who they are, right? So why are these stigmas wrong, right? We talked a little bit about it. They're locally and culturally constructed, just like race even is a construct, right? Out of the imagination of the human brain, right? And some poor person in their ignorance, and I'm not saying poor monetarily, but poor in terms of their thinking, wanted to construct this thing called race to divide human beings up a certain way. And so these constructs, right, feed stigma. And that's why words matter are important, and that's why us talking and having a conversation about this is important, because we get to deconstruct those kind of constructs. And what emerges out of that is a real understanding of the human community, the human experience, and how all of us as human beings can change and also make contributions in a different way. There are also instances of either seen as culturally accepted or stigmatized, group view others, valued, marked as identity as stigmas. Even today, you know, I was going into the restroom over here, right? I was telling Lily, how many people have noticed the restrooms over here today? What does the restroom say? Huh? Gender neutral, and when you walked in that restroom, physically, you may have saw somebody that doesn't look like you're used to looking like when you walk into those rooms. And I was talking to my colleague about that. Lily's like, okay, Andre, well, you know how it feels, right? Whenever we go in these rooms, right? But I'm saying that in context, right? We had these stigmas associated with identity because we've been socialized a certain way. We have to desocialize ourselves from the way in which we think and perceive the world, and making sure that we use language consistent with that is really, really important. Anything I missed, Lily? Anything? Okay. I told you we do that, right? Always, lady, Andre, you missed this? We do this all the time in the office too, by the way, right? So here's some examples, right? Fatness, right? In terms of unhealthy and wealthy, right? Now, some people look at fatness or whatever that thing is that they call, right, as someone being unhealthy. Well, at one point in time, you were considered to be wealthy if you were a bit corpulent, right? Or I'm trying to use some language that's not as like fat. Like, what is that, right? Or whatever, right? Age, right? We talk about sickness versus wisdom, right? In different cultures, we know that they value their people that are aging. You know, in the Asian community, in some instances, some Asian communities, they look at the older adults as ornaments to be revered and honored, right? Not looking at someone as a burden, as sickly. But in thinking about those things, right, how do these examples relate to the stigmas directly impact the people experience every day? Anybody want to share? Right, and I'll say it again, right? How do these examples that we're talking about relate to the stigmas directly impact the people experience every day? Discrimination? Anybody else? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we're socialized like that, right? To look a certain way, to be a certain way, to think a certain way. You know, we ask, where does that come from, right? Whose ideal and whose values are those that we're espousing, right? That we are now living by. And this is something that's good for the psychology because remember, in trying to keep up with this kind of imagery of seeming perfection, because that's what that's about too, right? This notion I got to look perfect and all that kind of stuff, right? That teeters on vanity, that teeters on tremendous pressure you put on the psychology to be that way, that causes all kind of dysfunctions in relationships and all that kind of stuff. We don't even look deep enough into that. It's just that whatever this is, it looks a certain way, it's good, it's fine, but it's not. Oh, of course it does, right? Because under the veneer of that is some other stuff that we haven't addressed, right? You had your hand up, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah. Are you talking about my gray? No, you're right. You're right. It's true, right? Someone may have gray hair. That's not indicative of someone being old necessarily or sickly even. But the very moment we see somebody with like gray hair, we think, oh, that person may be older. It's not true. It's even a little fashionable now. If I had some hair on my head, I might put some gray in there. Yes?
I was close to jury duty a few years ago, and I was not picked because I was young. And I really wanted to serve because I didn't want to work that day.
Safe space.
It was like, and every time I go, I don't get picked, and I'm like, should I need to dress myself up to look a certain way to serve, to do something that I want to do? But I got another summons. I'm gonna see.
And it's an interesting point that you raise, right? In terms of people who've been impacted by the criminal legal system, right? How do you want us to be? Like, what do you want us to do? Like, I don't know. I don't know, we just go in our soul or something and pull out like all the stuff that we did. Say, here, I did all this stuff. I'm repentant or whatever. No, I'm not the person I used to be. It's not possible, right, necessarily. You look at people based on their actions. Now, obviously, that's unfair and I think, frankly, wrong, right, for them to say because you look young, and you do, right, that you can't serve, right? Can you imagine someone who has a conviction history, right, going before an employer and say, well, we can't hire you, right, because you have a conviction history. And obviously there are laws that prevent that, right, Fair Chance Act, et cetera. But people are still practicing that, right, in housing, which we're talking about now, which Lily and I and others are advocating to make sure legislation is passed to prevent that from happening even more. But from people that have conviction histories, people impacted by the criminal legal system face those kind of challenges, right?
And then sometimes the jobs that they do in the prison, when they get out, they can't do the same job because they have a record.
That's exactly right. Someone else had their hand up too before we move on. Yes?
I think that is kind of like we see people as worthy or unworthy.
Worthy or unworthy, have a social work background, and so they had the deserving and undeserving, right? From a historical perspective as it relates to social work for some social workers in the room. And similar, like those who are worthy and those who are unworthy. And then who prescribes that? Who says that? Right? Yes. Yeah.
I think that advertisers who can profit off of us feeling miserable start a lot of it.
Yeah. Again, the narrative is huge, right? Lily and I work a lot of the time talking about how do we change narratives, right? We don't have influence necessarily over the major media outlets that feed us information. You have to think about it, right? The news, right? I thought about like news, like NEWS. You know what that stands for? News? Right. Somebody said it, right? Right? North, east, west, and south, right? News, right? I don't know for certain, but we do know that there's some major news outlets that promotes most of the news that we see. And you have to think about it. There's always a rerunning of the same thing. And you have to also say to yourself, like, how much can you learn about something in 30 seconds? But it's just enough to like stimulate you a certain way, to make you think a certain way, to condition you to think a certain way. And we don't think about those often enough. Yes?
So for me, when I
or had certain experience, but people in general. Personally, I decided to stop watching the news in 2007. I do not watch the news. I don't own a TV. That's my choice. I have a phone. Whatever I need to know comes up to me. I chose to do that because the media amplifies everything, and there's a large element of control. So they control what you think, how you see everything, and you as an individual, you have to take that personal responsibility to learn to control that narrative. And it starts with one person at a time. But I teach that because that's my conviction. And I feel like the only way really for transformation to take place is by renewing your mind.
And that's why we're in this room, right? Because we want to be a part of this conversation on how we can look at words, why words matter, and more importantly, what language can we use to ensure that we're countering that narrative, right? Because it's an alternative narrative that comes from people who are seeking to live a life of equity and fairness and seeking to empower people so that they aren't treated inhumanely, right? So I'll move along, right? I miss anything, Eddie? Lily? Okay. All right. We're going to hand out something. Now, want me to take half, Lily? I'll take half. Oh, you got it? I'll take half. Oh, okay, cool. Happy to do that. I think I talk a lot, a little bit. I mean, I can't talk a cat off a fish wagon, but I can talk a little bit. Now, you got to be skilled to talk a cat off of a fish wagon. That's a little joke, right? You got to laugh a little bit, right? Again, we want to make sure you don't fall asleep from that good food that you ate, because food is a drug. I always, I don't like sometimes doing presentations right after lunch, because I have to contend with that. The thing, you know the thing, right? The thing that I see some of y'all back there doing, the thing. No judgment, I'm just identifying something, but I'm not judging anybody for it, right? So, what Lily just handed out to you before we get to it, right? Because I know you all want to read it first. I just want to give you some historical context of what you have in your hand and what we're going to read in a bit. But Eddie Ellis is the founder of the Center for New Leadership on Urban Solutions. Some of you, I don't know, anybody in this room heard of Eddie Ellis before? Eddie Ellis, right? Okay. So Eddie Ellis was a person who served 25 years in prison for a crime he maintains he never did. He was a part of the Black Panther Party in the 60s. While Eddie was incarcerated, he and other men began to create what is called the Resurrection Study Group. And the Resurrection Study Group was comprised of men who were incarcerated who sought to want to change their lives, but also wanted to give back to the community, and also wanted to interface with legislation in a way that they would begin to change policy, even while they're inside. And so when I was incarcerated in 1992, Eddie was released from prison. And the men that he had been engaged with there were teachers and leaders in the prison. Now, I came in prison 1992. I didn't know much about anything. I mean, I knew about Dr. Martin Luther King, right, because they teach you that in school. But that's only the extent of what I knew about history, vis-a-vis like my own history as someone that's black in this country, about the world, about politics. I knew nothing, right? And these men were responsible for engaging younger men who were there with them to help them grow, to develop. And so I was one of them. And I walk around the yard, me and another friend of mine, and they always say, you guys are always together, right? We used to read stuff. And so we were pulled into that group of men that Eddie was a part of, which was the Resurrection Study Group, a think tank group inside the prison. And that's why I gained like a foundation. I began to gain identity. I began to learn like who I was relative to the world and what my purpose and aim was with that understanding. So when Eddie came home, he created what is called the Center for New Leadership on Urban Solution. It was the first formerly incarcerated academic think tank group in the country that was housed at Medgar College in Brooklyn. How many people familiar with Medgar College in Brooklyn? My alma mater, that's where I got my undergraduate associate degree from, and then wound up teaching there for 5 years. Isn't that something, right, Lily? As an adjunct lecturer for 5 years. But Eddie had created this institution within an academic institution. And while he was there, he wanted to make sure that we begin to start changing how we talk about and describe people with conviction histories. Hence the reason why you had that letter in your hand, because he created this language letter that you have, right? And his premise and what he maintained is that people currently are formerly incarcerated, people on parole, people recently released from prison, people in prison, people with conviction histories, we are people. So I think we're going to read it or something? Yeah. Okay. So we can read it, and how many people want to support in reading it? Maybe take a paragraph or two, one person there. Anybody else? One poor person, 3 people? Okay, so we have 3 people that you can read. You need a microphone? Let me get a little exercise here.
We thought it was really important to read it out loud and sit with the sound of it.
Right. Okay. Take your time. We start here. We start here. Dear friends.
Okay. Dear friends, the Center for New Leadership on Urban Solutions is a human justice policy, advocacy, and training center founded, directed, and staffed by academics and advocates who are formerly incarcerated. It is the first and only one of its kind in the United States. One of our first initiatives is to respond to the negative public perception about our population as expressed in the language and concepts used to describe us. When we are not called mad, dogs, animals, predators, offenders, and other derogatory terms, we are referred to as inmates, convicts, prisoners, and felons. All terms devoid of humanness, which identify us as things rather than as people. These terms are accepted as the official language of the media, law enforcement, prison, industrial complex, and public policy agencies. However, they are no longer acceptable for us, and we are asking people to stop using them.
All right, excuse me. Help me out. Thank you very much.
In an effort to assist our transition from prison to our communities as responsible citizens and to create a more positive human image of ourselves, we are asking everyone to stop using these negative terms and to simply refer to us as people. People currently or formerly incarcerated, people on parole, people recently released from prison, people in prison, people with criminal convictions, but people. We habitually underestimate the power of language. The Bible says death and life are in the power of the tongue. In fact, all of the faith traditions recognize the power of words, and in particular, names that we are given or give ourselves. Ancient traditions considered the naming ceremony one of the most important rites of passage. Your name indicated not only who you were and where you belonged, but also who you could be. The worst part of repeatedly hearing your negative definitions of me is that I begin to believe it myself. For as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. It follows then that calling me inmate, convict, prisoner, felon, or offender indicates a lack of understanding of who I am, but more importantly, what I can be. I can be and am much more than an ex-con or an ex-offender or an ex-felon. The Center for New Leadership on Urban Solutions believes that if we can get progressive publications, organizations, and individuals like you to stop using the old defensive language and simply refer to us as people, we will have achieved a significant step forward in our life-giving struggle to be recognized as the human beings we are. We have made our mistakes, yes, but we have also paid or are paying our debts to society.
More exercise. Okay. All right. All right.
We believe we have the right to be called by name as we choose, rather than what someone else decides to use. We think that by insisting on being called people, we reaffirm our right to be recognized as human beings, not animals, inmates, prisoners, or offenders. We also firmly believe that if we cannot persuade you to refer to us and think of us as people, then all our other efforts, our reform and change, are seriously compromised. Accordingly, please talk with your friends and colleagues about this initiative. If you agree with our approach, encourage others to join us. Use positive language in your writing, speeches, publications, websites, and literature. When you hear people using the negative language, gently and respectfully correct them and explain why such language is hurting us. Kindly circulate this letter on your various list serves. If you disagree with this initiative, please write and tell us why at the above address or email us at info@centerfornewleadership.org. Perhaps we have overlooked something. Please join us in making this campaign successful. With your help, we can change public opinion, one person at a time. Thank you so much. In solidarity and love, Eddie Ellis, founder.
And so, Eddie transitioned in 2014, right? He passed away, he had throat cancer, and he never smoked in his life. And Eddie was like, was his acolyte, right? He was like my father almost, right? And I would travel with him around the country, and he would speak, etc. But he was like a really good human being, like really smart too, right? Really smart. And I miss Eddie, right? But it's interesting, right? This letter has had some impact, and Lily will talk about it a little bit later on. But it's, just to show you how important it is that we gently and we humbly correct people when they use this language. I'll give an example. I was in D.C., I told you, for the last 3 days, and on Tuesday, the second day, we went out to lunch. And, people from throughout the country were there. And there was one person, she was from Virginia, and she worked for the sheriff's department. And we're having a conversation at the table, and she was really smart and certainly outspoken. And while she was describing the sheriff's goal to support people with accessing housing, guess what term she continued to use over and over and over again in that conversation? Inmate. Over and over. Because, the inmates. So, I sat there, and I was quiet. I'm just listening. There's about maybe 4 of us at the table. And, at some point, I waited, and I just, I said, I really thank you for your passion, your commitment to this work, right? My appeal to you would be just to think about the language that we use, because while it's supportive and helpful to want to advocate for people to access housing, on the other hand, it's harmful to use language that describes people in negative terms, right? And then I even sent her an email afterwards. And guess what I sent her in the email? This letter. And she wrote back, and that's why I was going in looking for my phone just to read her response, right, to the email, right? She just, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. To help me evolve and to grow. And this is what we can do. We can enjoin other people to think about the language that they use, because people are open to it, they just don't know. And it's our responsibility to be able to engage people like that. And she said, thank you, right? I really appreciate that. And as I responded to her, I said, no, thank you. I said, we're all evolving. As we're all seeking to support each other in this space, right, and doing this work, we have to continue to learn and grow. So I turn over to Lily now, because we're going to talk about some other stuff.
So we're going to skip ahead a little bit here because we want to get to a point where you all are having some conversations with each other and then reporting back out to the group. So just wanted to jump ahead to 2022. And in the spirit of this letter, a bill was passed, signed into law by Governor Hochul, on your birthday, August 8th. That's right. It's the bill that reduces harmful stigma against incarcerated people by correcting outdated terminology used in state law. That's a mouthful. Yeah, that's not very, it doesn't have a great ring to it. But what did this bill do? It amended the correction law, the state mental health law. Let me get this right here. It amended, forgive me 1 minute, just because it just shows where these terms come up, right? Right, so this amended the correction law, the executive law, the local finance law, the mental hygiene law, the penal law, the public health law, the social services law, and the administrative code of the city of New York by replacing instances of the word inmate or inmates with the words incarcerated individual or incarcerated individuals. And yeah, that's huge. And this is what State Senator Gustavo Rivera said. He said, language matters. I am proud that my bill to replace all references of the word inmate with incarcerated individual has been signed today. For too long, we as a society have thought of incarcerated individuals as less than people. The use of the word inmate further dehumanizes and demoralizes them. This is another concrete step our state is taking to make our criminal justice system one that focuses on rehabilitation rather than relying solely on punishment. And Assemblymember Jeffrey Aubrey said, penological terms such as felon, inmate, prisoner, offender, and convict dehumanize, degrade, and stigmatize people. Using a term such as incarcerated individual recognizes the humanity of people and exemplifies the redeemable value of human beings. This new law seeks to correct outdated terminology that adversely impacts an individual's transition back into their community. So what these elected officials are expressing here is exactly what Eddie Ellis was saying in this letter, although from a different vantage point. Right? And so what they're saying here is if we use language that refers to people as people, we are expressing a belief in their humanity and in their ability to transform, right? And if we believe in people and we believe in people's, everyone's ability to transform, what does that mean for our laws and our policies? Right, for our funding decisions, for what is written down and signed into law. And we experienced this during the hearing on a bill that we work very hard, still working very hard to get past, the Fair Chance for Housing Act, that would end discrimination, well, go some way towards ending discrimination against people with conviction histories here in New York City by private housing providers. In the hearing on that bill, the words that opposing council members and opposing members of the public used were not people or people with conviction histories or formerly incarcerated people. They were very ugly terms. Criminal was probably the least ugly of them, and it was stunning. And that shows their belief. Right? Which is really sad if you think about it. You know, everybody has heard the great Brian Stevenson quote, none of us should be judged by the worst thing we've ever done, right? That's what this is. That's what this really comes down to. And it also comes down to not perpetuating a system where we are telling people they should internalize these things about themselves, right? So I think now, with all of that in mind, we're going to turn to challenges and opportunities. Is that right? Yes. So we're going to turn. Now you folks, we're going to ask you folks, whoops, we're not doing this because we're beyond that. Yeah. Okay.
How's everybody feeling, by the way?
Yes.
Everybody okay? By showing your hand, how's everybody feeling? Woo! Okay. I need that. Make sure that food is digested. All right, cool.
So what we'd like folks to do, what do we have? We have half an hour left, is that right? So we'd like folks to get together in small groups, not prescribed number, just get with some neighbors and talk about, in this space where we're talking about access to housing, building supportive housing, affordable housing, what challenges does language present in your work? How do these issues surface in your work? If so, how? And what are the opportunities you see in your work to deepen your colleagues' understanding or bring them into this conversation or to move forward in some way? So challenges and opportunities.
Here's what we'll do.
Oh, we're gonna do something.
Start from here, here is one group, right? Here, there's one group, right? Back here, right here is one group. Right here, right up there is one group. You turn around, you have to like whoever you feel comfortable with, turn around. You don't have to like sit close if necessary.
Yeah. We'll give you about 15 minutes to talk, and then we'll ask someone to sort of take some kind of notes because we're going to do some report outs at the end, all right? Great.
And let it be organic, right? Whatever comes up in the conversation, it comes up. conversations going on. Hello, everybody. We're back now. We're back. Thank you. You see, these microphones are like pretty important. They have people like responding. Okay, everybody. How was that? How was the conversations? Pretty lively. So what we're going to ask is that each group kind of elect somebody to report out what was discussed. Right? I'll give people a minute from each group to elect one person from that group to kind of report out what was discussed. So you already figured out you already know who's going to speak? You already got your representative? You have your representative from your group? You got your representative from your group over there? Back there, I got your representative who's going to be reporting out? Over here too? Okay, that's it. Well, let's start with over here. You're up. All right. So we're going to have this group over here, the representative's going to report out.
Hi, everyone. So in our group, we discussed a couple of things, but I want to highlight one of the topics that we discussed that kind of branched out into a larger conversation that we had, is essentially using language to educate others of what supportive housing is. We kind of discussed that a lot of people have this misunderstanding of what supportive housing is, where they're like, I've had conversations, for example, with nurses, with other representatives from other organizations, home attendants, you know, where they're like, oh, this is shelter, right? And then you have to sit there and be like, no, this is permanent housing. They have their lease, they're tenants, they have their rights. We're just here to provide a little bit of extra support. So then it kind of branched out into one of the other people in the group. They said that it's very important to start using that language from the very beginning, where we can actually use it as an educational piece, where people can understand what our role is, understand what we do, and in that case, we don't offend other and in that case, we don't offend the tenants, because I've had tenants who have come up in different scenarios and they're like, I don't live in shelter, this is my apartment. And they get offended by that. So it's like not only validating that, you know what, you're independent, you're doing it, but also explaining our role and making it clear for everybody who's involved.
No, it's an important point you raised. Like Lily and I were having a fireside chat back there. We were talking about how service providers, we use the term like clients. And some of the people that we serve take umbrage or even take offense to that, right? That client, right? Or whatever, right? What that means. Anyway, who's the representative over here? I thought y'all had a representative over here. If you look at me, I'm going to give it to you. Whoever looks at me first, I'm going to give you the microphone. All right, I'm going to give it to you. All right, there we go. Thank you.
Okay, so one of our discussions was about housing challenges with formerly incarcerated people. We actually have people here that work in CRs and transitional housing before you get to supportive housing. And I know, like I brought up, I worked for an agency before that we would deny for drug conviction in the past 5 years. You couldn't be housed with us, but then other convictions were okay, which I didn't understand really. Like you could sort of murder someone, but if you sold drugs 3 years ago, we would deny you. So it was just like a broader conversation about the challenges of housing when you have something on your record.
It takes courage to represent the group, right? It's not easy, right? That's why nobody else did it. This person over here didn't even look at me. I was looking at they look. I said, whoever looks at me, they're like, nope, not me. Okay, who's the representative over here? Okay. Yeah.
Did you, I definitely cover challenges. Did you come up with any opportunities around this issue? All right, more to think about.
Like we were just kind of going back and forth, like how is this possible or why is this happening? I mean, my question was like, was it legal? But then I didn't want someone from my old agency in here. Was that legal what we were doing?
Right.
So, and then they were talking about like their programs and CRs and transitional
So we also spoke about some of the challenges with getting people into housing, but we also talked about it in the context of documentation from other providers, in specific, like clinical providers. I'm a therapist, and we have to, submit documentation for supportive housing. So just having the awareness about, number one, the language we use when we are writing up these documents, because they are going to be seen by other people, by housing providers that, can cause concern for them. I was stating that I had a client that was, denied because of he was formerly incarcerated. He's actually never even been convicted of anything, but had charges. So, so it's on both ends, right? On the clinical staff who's writing up this documentation, but also on the housing providers and what documentation they're requesting, and the request of the criminal history, because sometimes we don't even want to put that stuff, but it's, it's required. And also it doesn't really speak to the reality, right? Somebody may have been incarcerated many years ago, may have a charge from many years ago, but they may be very far removed from that, right? So also an opportunity we saw was like perhaps adding some things about like their current progress, right? Kind of where they're at now, because again, somebody can look really quote unquote bad on paper, but that may not be who they are. It's not indicative of who they are and who they are right now. Did I get everything? Yeah. Okay.
Right, let's give a round of applause too for that too. By the way, right, we didn't ask this question, but how many people in this room know somebody that's been in prison or jail before that's not a client or a participant? I figured a whole bunch of hands. Yep, right? I'm sure we all know somebody, right? Again, 750,000 people in New York City have conviction history, 11% of the adult population. You know somebody, right? And that's a secret that a lot of people share, right? That all of us in this room know somebody that's been in jail or prison before, some of whom may even be our relatives. That's a whole nother conversation. Who's representing over here? Okay.
So in our group, the 5-year rule definitely came up in terms of housing people in permanent supportive housing with a history of criminal history. One of the things I think we really talked a lot about is the chronically homeless component when we're talking about a permanent supportive housing program, and how your time in incarceration does not count towards that time clock. So we're asking people who come out of incarceration to continue to not have a home for up to a year or more than 4 times in a year so that they can identify as chronically homeless. Some of the conversation was people come from incarceration and then they go into shelter, and now we're gonna try and put them in their own apartment, and those permanent supportive resources to help someone start that can be challenging as well. So taking from incarceration and keeping them down. Like, we don't want them to come out and build themselves up immediately. We want them to come out and just be homeless and kind of hang out while we try and get that chronic component so that they can get into a program. Or if they're incarcerated and they don't come out with a diagnosis, so they don't come out with that mental health diagnosis that we might need for a permanent supportive housing program. So we talked a lot about that. So.
On a positive note, to follow up on this young lady, we went from not being able to accept people that had a criminal background within the last 5 years to being able to accept people, because we changed our viewpoints on that.
Give this person a warm round of applause too, the leader of this group. Next group over here, who's the representative? Okay.
So we kind of like touched the same discussion that Group 3 did. We talked about the residents and how, when they get to supportive housing, what's their interview process. So we talked about the mental illness diagnosis and removing that stigma and background of being incarcerated in the past. Some people need more education after, when they want to settle down, or maybe they need interview help when they want to get some job and like, do prospecting, but at the same time, they want to change that whole aspect of having that mentality and stereotype of being incarcerated in the past. Media education takes a big toll as well, so they want to move away from that. But we also have a development team here who rely heavily on that interview process when they're building the supportive housing units. They need those information to get the grants, the right grants from the state. So it was very interesting to have 2 points of view in the group. So our group was finance, right? We had all types
Wow. HRA, finance, development. Yes.
I just want to add something. So I would give you a great example. I used to be an auditor, and I was auditing Fountain House. Maybe you know this non-for-profit in Manhattan that helps people with mental disabilities. Doesn't matter how they develop it, right? So at some point, they stop calling those people clients, and they start calling them members. This is the difference. You're my client. It means that, you know, I'm helping people with mental disability, and you're my client, or you're a member of my organization. So what I'm saying that in each case, right, even normal words like client may have a negative connotation. So it's very important, like homeless. You can say the person is homeless, or you can say, do you need a house? Do you need a space to live? You know, so I think it's important in each different situation to develop the language that will not has a negative impact on the person.
All right, one round of applause here. We got our last group here. Our last group. Who's representing? Oh, that's right. You're the representative, right?
Hello again, everyone. In the context of challenges, we looked at a myriad of challenges, actually. One of them was discrimination in housing, and we had examples of residents at some of our shelters who were formerly incarcerated, went through the hassle of obtaining their documentation, whether it was their ID, their birth certificate, their social security card, and sometimes that's a very onerous process because they don't have anything to gather points. When they finally get through the process, apply for housing, and they're told that they are selected, then later on when they do their digging and find out that this person has been incarcerated before, then they say, we're not sure this person can get housing. Imagine what that does to the resident, thinking that they have this opportunity to be independent, and now another door is closed in their faces. Another challenge is the inability to find jobs, even though Fiona talked about those who may have, I don't know, studied something while they were incarcerated or learned a trade. They come out, they have a resume, but they will not be hired because of their history. And we talked about the fact that simply because they have that history doesn't mean they have a proclivity to do that same thing again, but they're not given a fair chance. The third one is, in terms of the language that is still being used, even though we have evolved a lot, there are still people who are using the language that is debilitating. And as we have heard from several groups today, sometimes the word clients can be a word that is derogatory depending on the context. And that's why we intentionally use residents, even though they are people experiencing homelessness, being in a temporary shelter. And the fourth challenge that we looked at is a stigma based on experience, which is not just limited to those who were formerly incarcerated, but maybe those who came from impoverished neighborhoods, irrespective of the background, just those different stigmas associated with them. And Sean said that those set us back. For example, even if someone had a negative police experience, that shapes the way that person thinks, and later on they may think, when they see a police officer, that that might happen again, whereas it may not. In terms of opportunities, we talked about just each person taking on that responsibility to be intentional about humanizing other people. We talked about the fact that one of our members, she has a media background, and we talked about how much the media influences and how we can still leverage that same media to change a narrative. And we know that the reason the media is the way it is because they intentionally do that. Imagine if that intention shifts, because so many people rely on the media and that narrative. So if they were to become a proponent of humanizing the language that is used, that would create massive change. And we live in hope. The third one is, in terms of engaging humanizing language, is in our different places of work, we have to take that on as individuals. And finally, to address this issue of, for example, the residents not being able to get jobs because of this history, we can seek to partner with organizations that actually specialize in employing people who were formerly incarcerated. And there are many organizations in New York City, especially nonprofit ones, dealing with people experiencing homelessness that hire individuals specifically if they had such a background. So I think we should start focusing a lot more on the solution in terms of looking for such organization instead of saying this is the barrier. Thank you.
Great. Got a couple more slides. Then we're going to ask you to take a group photo. Someone doesn't want to take it, perfectly fine. I'm not group photo and just sit where you are. Lily and I will stand face this way, and our colleague right here will just take a picture. If you don't want to, perfectly fine. No judgment yet. Right? Just think you all look great.
So thank you, everybody, for those wonderful contributions. And I feel like there's so much here that we could have spent so much more time unpacking. To the group that was talking about the chronically homeless problem, that's a real advocacy issue right there, right? Why is New York City 1515 structured so that you have to be chronically homeless and meet that HUD definition of chronically homeless, which excludes most people coming off of Rikers because the average stay is over 200 days, excludes anybody coming out of state prison because the stay there is by definition a year or more. So there's so much here, and I hope this is just the beginning of your thinking about this. And just some takeaways here, key principles to follow. Right? Engage people and respect their preferences. Use stigma-free and accurate language. Prioritize individuals over their characteristics, right? This is all about individuals, right? Not characteristics, which is challenging in a lot of fields, particularly the supportive housing field where there are certain boxes and eligibility criteria. How do you see people outside of those boxes and cultivate self-awareness, which is what today was really about. And just going back to Eddie Ellis's letter, what did he ask everyone to do? Be conscious of the language you use. Remember that each time you speak, you convey powerful word picture images. Stop using the terms offender, felon, prisoner, inmate, and convict. Substitute the word people for these other negative terms. Encourage your friends, family, and colleagues, and I will add, and your funders, and the other stakeholders to use positive language in their speech, writing, publications, and electronic communications. There's our, funny looking email addresses, but feel free to get our contact info if you want. And most of all, thank you so much for joining us today.